Hi, everyone. This is week three's check-in. We're going to go over a kind of overview of the foundational sociological theories that you've read about in this week and hopefully clarify any of the readings. Feel free to email me if you have questions or come into office hours on Fridays and Tuesdays. Okay, let's get started. So, um, think of these as ways of seeing the world. All of them are based on empirical analyses, but they are different ways of seeing the world. You feel free to critique, to challenge, and to build upon these frameworks. They are not necessarily the only or the right ways to see the world or to do sociology. So, first, we're going to start with Durkheim. Durkheim aimed to establish sociology as a legitimate science in the same way that physics and chemistry were understood. That means he wanted to do the same kind of method, the scientific method of creating hypotheses, testing the hypotheses, analyzing, and he simply saw sociology as another kind of science. It's just that there was a different phenomenon that sociologists were looking at. So where physics was looking at atoms and chemistry were looking at bonds, sociologists were looking at social facts. So the important thing to note of a social fact is it is a way of thinking, acting, and feeling that is outside of the individual and constrains or affects the individual. That should be affects with an A. That is a mistake on my part. So specifically, we're looking at social facts that are fairly widespread and common. So this could be something like wearing clothes every day. This is a way of acting that is a norm that is pressed upon us or constraining us, and it is outside of us. The idea and the action of wearing clothes did not start, nor will it end with any one person. It is something that exists outside of an individual. Another really good example is language. When you are born, you do not develop your own language. You adopt the language of a culture and community. And you have to speak that language to be able to communicate with the other people in the group. That is, so it constrains you to act and think in a certain way. Sociologists have also looked at how feeling and believing are also affected by social norms. So even the way we interpret our feelings is not immune from social influence. So any way of acting, thinking, or feeling that exists outside of the individual and is constraining the individual is a social fact. Now, Durkheim argues that social facts are normal if they are common, long-lasting, and widespread. So an example would be wearing clothes. And he argues that these normal elements exist precisely because they are beneficial in some way. That does not mean they are morally beneficial, but that they uphold the status of a society. So that means that social facts are functional, and sociologists should attempt to understand how they are functioning to support that society. So we can think of what would happen if humans stopped wearing clothes. And not just like to each individual, but to the society at large. How would society break down if clothes were not a part of society? And there are, many ways, like driving laws. How would society break down if there weren't driving laws? We could think of how many car crashes there would be, how many deaths there would be. So he would be looking at what are the normal aspects of a society, and if they are normal, what is their function? And he argues that crime is a great example of a social fact that is normal and functional for society to exist. So he argues that what crime actually is something that is when someone breaks social norms. So it offends the collective notions about what is right. And it's found in every society. and it's found in all time. So there is, because it is everywhere and because it has been around for a long time, it is normal. And thus we need to find out, how is crime functional for a society? Because it would seem that crime is actually pathological, but because it's a common occurrence, it's widespread, he says no, it's healthy, and thus it must serve some function. So Durkheim's analysis of what crime is that crime reinforces social norms, because whenever someone commits a crime, whether that is, sorry, it took away the share. When someone commits a crime, whether that is something small or like breaks a social norm, like making out in a public space, PDA, or whether that is something that is against the law specifically, like driving over the speed limit, murder, theft, there is a form of social control that will happen, whether that is simple, just like people asking you to stop making out in front of them, or whether is being arrested and incarcerated. There's a form of social control which helps reinforce the norms. It helps remind society why those norms are important in the first place. But also, crime is the means for social change. Before there was gay marriage allowed in the US and before there was anti-discrimination laws for sexual minorities, um, they had to commit crimes. LGBT folks were committing crimes to, push the notions of what morality is. They pride parades. They would do demonstrations, Stonewall, right? So eventually, up until now, it was the crime provided the means for social change. Without crime, there would never be social change. That is why it is functional. Okay, so let's move on to Karl Marx. Karl Marx um, was not a sociologist, but virtually every theorist after Karl Marx uh, debates him or builds upon him, so he's important to know. And these are the terms we are going to go over. So the mode of production is the organization, the economic organization in a society, and it's built upon two parts. The first is the means of production. So the means of production are any raw materials, land, lumber, ore, grain, seeds, and the tools needed to produce products. So factories, tools, a plow. Those are the means of production, anything necessary to produce an object. Then there are the relations of production. These are the ways in which society is organized according to the means of production, so especially in relation to ownership. So who owns the means of production? Who owns the land? Who owns the tools in the factories? The mode of production, thus, is the economic structure by which a society is organized. So he goes through four main kinds of modes of productions. First is the master and slave. This is when the master owns all of the means of production, and the relation of production is that the master even owns the other slaves. Slaves are considered a mean of production rather than humans. Then there are the plebeians. This is something as in Greek times where you had a small group of emperors and a lot of commoners. This was also similar to the feudal system in which you had the lords who owned most of the land, and then the serfs who worked on that land, and then eventually moving towards capitalism, in which you had the capitalists who are the bourgeois, who are owning the factories and land, and then the workers who work the land and sell their labor to and be able to purchase the means of production and the means of subsistence. Marx sees consistent conflict between all of the haves versus the have-nots. You have the haves on the left and the haves on the right of each of these systems. Um, and so recognize the relations of production are largely who owns the means of production and how do they distribute the necessary items to survive. In capitalism, particularly, Marx shows how, let's say you are a capitalist, you own a factory, you are driven to profit, not necessarily because you are greedy, but because if you do not gain enough profit, then a larger capitalist is going to come in and buy you out and thus take away your ownership. And thus, the capitalist must gain profit, and there are two main means through which it can gain profit. The first is innovation, in which you you find out how to create your products cheaper or better, and then exploitation, in which you reduce the wages of the workers. He sees that there will eventually be a time when technology no longer can reduce your costs, and thus if capitalists will continuously reduce the wages and buying power of the working class to a point that the majority of the world is living in poverty. This is what is called pauperization, the reduction of the entire world to an impoverished state where they barely can survive. And this will lead to a massive revolution and towards communism, in which private property will be abolished. He sees that in each of the modes of production, private property was one of the reasons why there had to be a change. That was the cause of the problems. And communism would eliminate private property and thus solve the history of class struggles. Weber, German sociologist, founding the first department of sociology in Germany, was really well known for his interpretive sociology and what we'll talk about today, ideal types and rationalization. So an interpretive sociology for Weber is understanding social action as a meaningful action oriented to others that carries an individual's reflexive or interpretive aspect. So there's two parts to this. There's the fact that an action is oriented to others. That's what makes it social. And what makes it a part of an interpretive social analysis is that this action has a meaning, and it's the individual has a reflexive or interpretive aspect to it. Now, society then is created through regularities of social action. So these are when actions are repeated by either the actor or multiple actors, because the subjective meaning is generally meant to be the same. So we could think about on Valentine's Day, when you give flowers to your partner, the reason that is seen as, the reason we do that on Valentine's Day is because collectively we agree that the meaning of flowers is a demonstration of love. However, if your significant other thought flowers were a demonstration of war, it would be very strange on Valentine's Day for them to receive flowers. Right? So regularities of social action have to have the same subjective meaning. Now, ideal types are a way to categorize those subjective meanings. So it's a conceptual model in which we categorize the subjective meaning so a sociologist can judge and classify the actual actions. Let's give the example. So, remember, Weber's trying to understand the motivation and the meanings behind action. He gives a typology, so ideal types, of 4 different kinds of action: 2 rational types of action and 2 irrational actions. Ens rational is for those kinds of action in which the actor has an end goal in mind that's different than the action itself. For example, if I'm taking this class because I want to get a degree, right? So the class is not the end goal itself, the degree is. Value rational action is an action in which the the person is doing it because they value the action itself. So someone who's taking this class because they value education and want to learn more. Irrational action is, there are two types. The affective action, that is when you act out of emotion. So we could think of someone who punches their sibling for, making them angry, or kissing their partner when they receive the flowers. It's something they do out of emotional response. Or traditional action. This is something that is habitual. So this could be either something that you do without thinking, like driving on the right side of the road. You don't really make that decision every time you drive. You simply drive, right? It becomes ingrained in you and you act out of habit. So let's take an example of someone who posts fake news on the internet. We could imagine that there are 4 types of motivation behind posting fake news. Someone with an ends rational post might be deliberately stirring up the population and trying to get people to vote for a different candidate. A value rational meaning behind posting fake news might be someone who finds value in stirring up chaos, right? An emotional or affective action might be someone who read the fake news, got so angry about it, they reposted it. Traditional action of posting fake news might be someone who instinctively and just is on Facebook and scrolling through and just keeps posting everything they see their friends post. They just keep reposting. So this is 4 different kinds of motivations behind doing the same exact action. That is one of the ways in which Weber is trying to understand the motivation and meaning behind people's actions. He also moves from a small scale understanding individuals to understanding larger groups. And so one way he does this is by looking at power and authority. Power is the ability to influence other people doing things they otherwise wouldn't do. This could be both for good or for bad, right? Influencing people to work out and be healthy, or influencing people to steal from their neighbor. A type of power is having authority, which is the likelihood that a command will be obeyed among a group of persons. And legitimate authority is when that command is obeyed without physical force or threats of force. Illegitimate authority then would be someone being coerced to act. So legitimate authority has 2 dimensions to it that are important. First, that we have to think about what are the motivations, and so what does the legitimacy have? How does the authority have a claim to legitimacy? So here are 3 types of, remember these are ideal types by which we can judge actual authority. And we are going to look at the claim of that legitimacy. So what is the motivation by which the people obey, and where that obedience is located? Where do they find or locate, how to put this? Is the obedience owed to a system? Is it owed to a person, right? Who are they obeying, actually? So in legal rational, this is when a person, this is a system of authority based on accepted legal rules and the legality of policies. So we as people we accept a legal system and accept the rulers in that system, who generally are elected or appointed. So in a legal rational system, we obey the office and the legal system. We don't necessarily obey the person, we're obeying the office. So an example of that is the presidency of the US. If you remember, even as far back as Obama, people would say Obama or Trump or Biden is not my president, I'm not going to follow him. And the supporters might say, well, you might not like him, but he is the president, respect the office. Meaning you still need to follow him because he is the president, and we have all, as members of the country, accepted this legal system. That is not to say that the detractors did accept the legal system, but that is a a legal rational system would be one in which the populace does accept the authority of whoever is in office. A traditional system is which traditions are legitimate simply because people accept them as legitimate or because they believe they are divine, and they follow the person in power as long as that person is abiding by tradition. So one example is the king of Saudi Arabia, in which he is a total monarch. There is no democracy. It is a complete monarchy. As long as that person follows tradition, or in the case of illegitimate authority, they force people to follow, the obedience is owed to the person, right? So as long as the king of Saudi Arabia is not going outside the bounds of tradition, people will, in that country, follow him. If he goes outside of tradition, he will either need to exert force or he will lose his authority. Charismatic authority is based on a person's extraordinary heroism, divinity, magic, or, character. And that they are able to lead based on that magical or extraordinary power. And as long as they have that charisma, they will retain that authority and people will follow them. One example is Stacey Abrams. She is not an elected official, so she does not necessarily have an office by which people have given authority. She has not inherited a traditional position of authority. And so people are not giving her obedience or following her because of any traditional system. Instead, she has some charisma that people find compelling enough to follow her and to accept her leadership. So she has charismatic authority. Now, remember, Weber would say there is no, in reality, very few of these authority types really line up. So we could see that people might have multiple types of authority. One of the biggest examples was Donald Trump. While even as president, he still had a lot of charisma that drove people to follow him. If Stacey Abrams was elected, she would also inherit some legal, rational authority in addition to her charismatic authority. Okay, let's move on to W.E.B. Du Bois. He founded the first American School of Sociology at the University of Atlanta and provided theories of the social construction of race, sociological analyses of Black Americans, social psychology, and more. He was one of the most influential sociologists, even though he was marginalized by his fellow white scholars. So Today we're going to cover 3 different aspects of his sociology, including double consciousness, the veil, and being a problem. We'll start with the latter. So, what is it to be a problem? Is a condition in which a society has marginalized a group of people and now have to deal with what to do with them. So this was often described by his contemporary Booker T. Washington, who talked about the quote-unquote Negro problem. And what Du Bois called it was the dead weight of social degradation. Right? So that is what it is to be a problem, is that there has been a marginalized group for so long that they are and have been socially degraded that they become or are understood to be a dead weight on society. And what he says that causes quite a few problems. So first, when we talk about the veil, we are going to talk about the structure that created the problem. And then when we talk about double consciousness, we'll talk about what the problem does to the social psychology of individuals. So the veil, Du Bois argued that racism and the practices of segregation excluded blacks from mainstream American life, and thus the veil shut them out of the world. So it created a structural barrier by which black folk could not have opportunities and integration into the wider U.S. society. However, he also believed that the veil offered the Black community a profound insight into the divided nation. It helped them critically analyze these structures and systems that created that veil. And you might remember this phrasing from Alden Morris. He calls this the second sight. So the veil has two purposes or two consequences. It both creates a material barrier against Black individuals, but it also provides them with unique ability to critically analyze. So this is the system that created the problem. And the consequences of the problem for Black individuals was double consciousness. This is a requirement of having to look at oneself through the eyes of others. So in the US, especially during the time of Du Bois, it was quote unquote a white man's world through which the culture, religions, the economic system were all created through the white man's view. And so when you are educated by a white culture as a Black person, you are looking at yourself through the eyes of another. That means measuring your own soul, he wrote, by the tape of a world that only looks on in contempt and pity. So it caused conflict within Black Americans to understand their two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body. So that is what we'll cover for Du Bois. Ida B. Wells was a journalist. Like Marx, she was not strictly a sociologist, but often sociologists have borrowed from her work, and she is often credited with the founding of Black feminism. She uncovered the ways in which news and politicians frame social issues to provide legitimacy for oppression and violence. And so in her book, Southern Horrors, this is what she did. The prevailing racial wisdom during Reconstruction and the Jim Crow era was that Black persons were inferior, they were sexually deviant, and would attack the purity of white females, and that thus they must be controlled or eliminated. And so lynching was a punishment for Black men, and the excuse was for their defilement of white females via rape. So anytime that there was a lynching, they would say, well, this person had raped a white woman. Well, exposes that this framing of lynching was false. She went through and analyzed each case of lynching and found that most, if not all, occurred without any proof of rape or any other crimes, and that what would happen is the claim of rape would happen after the lynching occurred. That would be the first time the media or the public would raise the issue. And so the white press and white elite created, quote unquote, the new cry to legitimate lynching, and this new cry was the purity of white women. And so the white press then created a racial panic, perpetuating this right cry narrative, and Wells exposes the falsity of this. Okay, that is what we are covering today. If you have questions, feel free to email or stop by this office hours. Hopefully this cleared up some of the questions you had about the readings, and good luck on your work this week. Thank you.